the summer? You know it is summertime when it's sweaty up here in the vinyl attic. I had to put the AC unit on to keep these beautiful record albums cool from melting. But it's fitting because we're going to talk about a hot album tonight. Hot is the best word to describe this album. If you don't know, if you're a first-time viewer, we're doing this sort of 100 albums that should be in your collection. 100 albums that aren't the obvious big ones, although this one certainly was pretty popular, but I want to give it some love. We are going to talk about the first Van Halen album. Van Halen, just called Van Halen, comes out February 10th, 1978. Look at that. What? That's David Lee Roth right there, full genuflect. This record was a monster, and it really changed things. I want to talk about why this record is so important. The heavy metal music scene in 1977 was kind of not really there. We hadn't really got to metal as we came to know it. I mean, heavy metal in 77 was basically Kiss, the last days of Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, maybe the first Judas Priest record as a sort of a little indicator of the way things are going, or maybe first Judas Priest. But there wasn't really anything happening, and it was all kind of British in orientation, most of it, Black Sabbath. The scene, though, had lots of bands bashing it out. I mean, I remember in my town, there was a band called Fragile that did the rehearsals in a basement down the street from my house, and I was like, yes, rock and roll. And so in little scenes all around the country, including in Los Angeles, including a little town called Pasadena, there were bands bashing it out, and one of them was a band called Van Halen from Pasadena, California, and they caught the attention of Gene Simmons of Kiss, who said, these guys got something good. There's a guitarist, there's a bass player who sings high harmonies, there's a drummer, and there's this flamboyant front man. They could go somewhere. And so he recorded some demos with them that didn't really do very well. And apparently they weren't happy because they had to use borrowed equipment. But Gene Simmons promised to get them a deal. But then he went off on tour with Kiss and on the 77 Love Gun tour, which I saw as a 13-year-old kid. In the meantime, they start booking these gigs and getting some attention, including at the Whiskey A Go-Go in L.A. The Whiskey A Go-Go, where I was just out last month. I saw a Led Zeppelin tribute band play there. Which was amazing because Led Zeppelin actually played on that stage in 1969. So in the audience are some record people who start kind of offering this band deals. And they end up signing with Warner Brothers. I give Gene Simmons credit. And get this producer to work on this record, Ted Templeman, whose primary claim to fame was he was the main producer of the Doobie Brothers, which weren't necessarily a heavy metal band, but they had a pretty, clean sound. He'd also produced an album we mentioned last time, Van Morrison's brilliant live album, Too Late to Stop Now, and took him into the studio for about a week in West LA, in West Hollywood. Basically took their live show, which were a bunch of original songs and a couple covers, and put this record together. And when it's released in early 1978, it is like nothing that has ever existed before. And I can tell you, as a kid, in 77, 78, the main problem with the world was disco. Like, disco was just taking over everything. Everything was going disco. Rock stars were making disco records. They were doing disco versions of, kid songs. I mean, it was just the most banal, worst thing in the world. And we were craving rock and roll. And you had kind of this bloated, proto-metal. The main place that we found it was punk rock. that in the Ramones and in the Jam and in the Clash and the Sex Pistols, that was the sound of the guitars. That's where the guitars went. There was certainly nothing that dynamic coming out of the hard rock scene or anything like that. Not to us kids who are listening to the radio. And then all of a sudden, there is this sound, and it is the sound of the new generation of rockers, in this case Van Halen, discovering the old generation of rockers, in this case the Kinks, and this sound was magic. That sound coming over the radio was like an atom bomb. It was huge. It was huge. The sound was clearer and louder than anything we had heard in a while, especially on the backdrop of, bad pop music and disco. This thing just exploded. And everybody, including us like little suburban kids who were just waiting for some loud guitars, just went, whoa, what? What was that? What was that? And then it comes in with all this theatrics. Van Halen was completely unique. There was nothing like it. There was no sort of antecedent to say, oh, here's the thing before Van Halen that leads to Van Halen. Because they were Southern California. They had a big blonde guy with, rippling abs screaming and wailing and making jokes, and they didn't have a rhythm guitarist, which was normal in metal. They just had this one guy who played guitar by tapping it. Like, what is that? You had these harmonies coming in from Michael Anthony, this really great rhythm section, and it was completely unique. And all of a sudden, you had something that wasn't but was punk. Now, the term punk in 1978, it was completely misused. Anything that was different was punk. I have this Kiss book I got when I was 14 years old in 1978, the story of Kiss, and the back says, Punk Power. I don't think Kiss is very punk, but because they were different from everything else, it was punk. So there is this sort of punk element, this surfer, skateboard, Southern California hardcore, but with the long hair. And so this record made all kinds of inroads in places where rock and roll wasn't being played. All of a sudden on the radio, you just had this massive sound of music. The cover, one of the things you might know, this cover was so great. I should just stare at this cover because these guys all look so cool. Was taken at a show at the Whiskey A Go-Go. There you go, Whiskey A Go-Go. It just keeps popping up in music history. And the record found an audience. It went right up to 19 on the charts, and it found an audience, especially among suburban kids who were kind of left behind by the disco movement and looking for something that was more rocking. There's the Kinks cover. There's a kind of old Chicago blues cover of Ice Cream Man, which is a lot of fun. But the originals are really great too. Running with the Devil is just a massive song, and the solo on it is played by Eddie Van Halen on an electric sitar, and so it had some unique sounds on it as well. The door that was opened by Van Halen to bring sort of the Southern California vibe opened the door for what would be the 80s hair metal phenomena. All those bands, all the Poisons and, Rats and all those bands that came out of Southern California in the 80s were sort of the stepchildren of Van Halen. The follow-up record that came out next year, Van Halen 2, was was even more successful. I loved it because it had a really great cover of "You're No Good," the song that Linda Ronstadt made popular, and "Dancing the Night Away." They were just meant for the radio. But there was this sort of now invented this new genre. I did get to see Van Halen on this tour, not at the Whiskey A Go-Go. I wish I would have. I was just a little teen, but I saw them on the Never Say Die tour, which was. You ready for this? Black Sabbath. Final Aussie tour with Black Sabbath, Van Halen, and the Ramones. And I went mainly because I wanted to see the Ramones. But the Van Halen set was so much fun. I just, I became a fan. And one of the cool things about this record, it gave permission to some of the punk kids to like something that was a little bit more metal, just because they were so extreme. I mean, the songs on this record are timeless. Jamie's Crying, Ain't Talking About Love, Eruption, the guitar solo song. They still sound great so many years later. 1978, this record really opens the door for a whole new genre. Look at these guys. Eddie, we miss you. But he had a long life of shredding the guitar. But the other thing I should mention about this is this also kind of forefronted the notion of the guitar hero. There was a ton of kids that picked up the guitar because they wanted to be like Eddie Van Halen. They wanted to kind of have that superstar status of the lead guitarist. And the fact that they only had one guitarist in the band pushed them even farther to the front. And of course, David Lee Roth was the showman's showman. I mean, it was just a full package of something that had never been seen before. It was funny, intense, sexy, sexual, sexist, kind of all those things woven in. But the record really stands the test of time. All right, I needed to talk about Van Halen. Wanted to give it a little love. We're going to stay a little bit in the metal vein next time, since we're saying goodbye to Ozzy. He's not dead. He's just sort of retiring. But I do want to give some tribute to a great album, Paranoid album. We're going to do that next time on Vinyl Fetish. We're gonna stay in a heavy duty vein for a little bit. But in the meantime, these guys matter. They made so many great records, and they just kept going and going and going until that 1984 album. Yeah, a lot of people. Chuck Eddy said that's the album that killed heavy metal. In his book Stairway to Hell, he was like, that's the album that killed heavy metal. And then David Lee Roth took off, and Sammy Hagar took over, and they made some good records that sounded great on MTV. But it was never like this. It never was the explosion that this album was in 1978. This album matters. This music matters. This band matters. You matter. Let's talk about it.